So, in this lecture, I want to start talking about this idea of missing premises. And, in this lecture, I just want to introduce the very basic idea of missing premises. And the basic idea is pretty simple. Um, the problem is applying this idea, spotting missing premises is not the hardest thing in the world. Filling them in, figuring out what a good missing premise is, can be very, very difficult. It's, in fact, one of the most difficult things we're going to do in this class, for reasons I'll talk about in the next lecture. It's something that just takes a lot of practice to do well. You just need to kind of drill on this over and over. Most students find this kind of hard, I'm going to admit, but I think it gets easier with practice. But for right now, I just want to talk about the basic idea of what a missing premise is and how to spot them. And we're going to look at some very simple arguments. Now, you'll often hear this called a lot of different things, right? This idea of missing or missing premises, you'll sometimes hear it called implied premises, suppressed premises, assumed premises. Some people will just say assumptions. Some people who want to get real fancy with it will talk about enthymemes. They're all getting at the same idea. The argument assumes a premise it does not explicitly state. Let me give you guys some examples of very simple arguments that do this. Obviously, it is not always wrong to lie. If it were always wrong to lie, then it would be wrong to lie to a murderer to protect his intended victim. Now remember, what are we going to do in an argument? We always find the conclusion. Obviously, it's not always wrong to lie. Then we put that at the end and put the premises in numbered form, right? There's only one premise here. If it were always wrong to lie, then it would be wrong to lie to a murderer to protect his intended victim. Conclusion, it is not always wrong to lie. But notice, there's kind of a gap here, right? One says, well, if it's always wrong to lie, then it will be wrong to lie to a murderer to protect his intended victim. Two says it's not wrong to lie. How do you connect these two, right? Well, easy way to do this, it is not wrong to lie to a murderer to protect his intended victim, right? So it is not always wrong to lie. This fills in the gap in the argument. Here's one that might be even more obvious. This one, I can't resist. This is a famous argument against Kant's ethics, Kant being a very influential philosopher. Kant thought that his moral theory meant you could not lie to a murderer to save the murderer's victim. Most people have not found that super plausible. We'll talk more about this later. Actually, it's an example we'll use later. A lot of people tried to say Kant might actually be wrong about his own moral theory. We'll put that aside, right? I'm just using this as an example. Here's a simpler one, right? Since she's a self-described feminist, Laura is probably a liberal. Laura is a self-described feminist, so she's probably a liberal, right? We look at our conclusion, she's probably a liberal. Look at our premises, there's only one. Put this in standard form. She's a self-described feminist, so she's probably a liberal. Now notice, again, there's a gap here, and I think with this one it should be even more obvious. One tells us she's a feminist, two says she's probably a liberal, right? And now look, some of you might think, well, if we fall back on our stereotype of feminists or what we think we know about feminists, this might seem like it's a decent argument. But just look at what's actually written on the slide here, right? One talks about her being a feminist, two talks about her being a liberal. There is no statement here, there's nothing explicit that links being a feminist with likely, probably being a liberal. The argument, there's a gap. You need something that links being a self-described feminist to being a liberal or probably being a liberal, right? You can think of this argument almost like it's, there's just like a ditch, or a stream. You need a bridge over it. There's a gap here. The gap needs to be filled, and the gap is you need to connect this idea of being a self-described feminist to probably being a liberal. We fill in premise 2 here. Most self-described feminists are liberals, so Laura is probably a liberal. This links, number 2 does, the idea of being a feminist or self-described feminist and being a liberal. It fills in the gap in our argument. Now, notice the structure of these arguments. In both cases, the implied premise provides dependent support with another premise. One, being a self-described feminist, provides no support to probably being a liberal. It needs a dependent premise, number 2, for it to provide that support. Statement 1, if it were always wrong to lie, then it would be wrong to lie to murder protect his intended victim. On its own does not provide any support to it is not always wrong to lie. You need this number 2 statement with it. It is not wrong to lie to a murderer to protect his intended victim, right? If we were diagramming it, we would use that little bracket, the 1 circle, 2 circle, put a bracket around them, draw the arrow down. So, it's one good way to, spot a missing premise. They always provide dependent support. If there's a premise that looks like on its own it provides no support for the conclusion, but it would if you added another premise to it, that is a good indication there's a missing premise. And then you need to figure out, well, what is a premise I can add to this so that it would support the conclusion? Now, one thing I want you guys to notice, there are a lot of ways we could have filled in the missing premise in the last couple of arguments. Let's look at the feminist one, right? We could have all self-described feminists are liberals, some self-described feminists are liberals, most self-described feminists are liberals. Why did we fill it in, or why did I fill it in the way that I did? Well, let's look at some examples and see why I did that. Laura is a self-described feminist. All self-described feminists are liberals, so Laura is probably a liberal. Now look, would number 2 along with number 1 support our conclusion? Yeah, it would, right? If all self-described feminists are liberals and Laura is a self-described feminist, then there is a 100% chance that she is a liberal. If there's a 100% chance, well, definitely fits with probably. It's a lot more than probably, right? Well, why not fill the argument in this way? Well, let me ask you guys this. Is 2 true? No, right? I think it's, I haven't looked at polls, but I think it's probably true that most self-described feminists are liberals. I don't know, I forget the percentages. I should really look at a poll. I think it's right at or maybe a little over 50%. It's a decent number, right? But there are lots of self-described feminists who are not liberals. A lot of them are moderates. Some are even self-described conservatives. Some would say, well, I'm a libertarian. I don't fit in any of your brackets, right? Libertarian being someone who's conservative on economic issues, generally liberal on social issues. So 2 is just false. False premise is not good in an argument, so 2 is not a good way to fill this in. You don't end up with a good argument, right? So 2, A1, not a good way to fill this in because it's false. It doesn't give the person a good argument. Well, what about A2? Some self-described feminists are liberals. Well, some is a vague word, right? I mean, if 10% of self-described feminists were liberals, this statement would be true, right? But look, if only 10% are, you don't have any good reason to think she probably is. So the premise provides absolutely no support for the conclusion, or at the very least, almost none, right? Some could be true if just 1% were, right? that gives almost no support for this conclusion. She's probably a liberal. In fact, I would say it gives you none. So 2 gives you, like A1 gives you a lot of support, but it's false. A2 is true, right? It's definitely true. If you can find one feminist out there who's a self-described liberal, then some self-described liberal feminists are liberals. But 2 provides no real support for the conclusion. It's not a good premise either, right? Remember the principle of charity. You want to give the other person the strongest argument you possibly can. If you can give them a good argument, you have to give them a good argument. Remember, Lavin talks about this. So when you're filling in missing premises, the principle of charity is super important. You need to try within reason. We'll talk about what within reason means next lecture. You need to, within reason, try to give the other person a strong argument. In fact, the strongest argument you possibly can. And this ends up you have to do 2 things. You need premises strong enough to establish the conclusion. Some self-described feminists or liberals isn't a premise that's strong enough to establish the conclusion. But the premise should not be so controversial that it's obviously false or would be rejected by most people. In some sense, all self-described feminists are liberals is a very strong premise, but it's so strong that it's obviously false, right? So you end up, when you're filling in missing premises, a lot of times there's this balancing act, and you want to put them, to snatch in a term from astronomy. They talk about this for habitable planets. They got this from the 3 bears, the little fairy tale. You need to get the premises to fit into a sort of Goldilocks zone, right? They need to be strong enough to actually support the conclusion, but the premises can't be obviously wrong or even really controversial. Really controversial, we'll talk more about this, meaning that most people would reject it. You need to find a premise that is obviously true, if possible, or at the very least that most people would accept, that you yourself find true and think obviously true, but it also needs to be one that's actually strong enough to provide good support for the conclusion. Let's look at how this might work with our other argument that has a missing premise. If it were always wrong to lie, then it would be wrong to lie to a murderer to protect his intended victim. It is not always wrong to lie. This one isn't quite as neat an argument. It's a little messier, but we can look at some other candidates for the missing premise. Way we did fill it in was, it is not wrong to lie to a murderer to protect his intended victim. It is not always wrong to lie. Look at some other ways we could have filled this in, though. We should do everything we can to save the lives of other human beings. Well, if that were true, then, it wouldn't be wrong to lie to a murderer to save his intended victim. In fact, you should. If you need to lie to save the life of another person, you should do it. That would also make our argument work. But this is too strong, right? If you could save the life of another human being by giving up your own kidney, it's not clear to me that you should do that, right? If you could save the life of another human being by torturing an innocent child, it's not at all clear to me you should do it. In fact, I would say you probably shouldn't, right? So 1 as a premise is obviously false. 2, when we can save the lives of other human beings without paying a real cost, we should do so. That's almost certainly true. But, somebody might say, well, I don't know, lying to me is paying a real cost. So 2 wouldn't be enough to establish the truth of our conclusion, right? 3 is the best one here, right? A, because it talks about the stuff you see in the other terms in the argument. These other 2 are way too general. They don't talk about murderers and victims. But it's in this Goldilocks zone of, well, It's strong enough to get you our conclusion, but it's not so strong or out there that people would just reject it, right? So we'll talk a lot more about this, but hopefully this makes a bit of sense to you guys. We'll talk a lot more about this stuff about premises being controversial, non-controversial. It's a really important concept. Sometimes I'll talk about the weight of a premise, right? The more controversial it is, the heavier it is. You know, think about this like you're building an airplane. You want a premise that's strong enough to support your conclusion, but you don't want one that's so heavy that it weighs your argument down unnecessarily, right? If you built airplanes out of like steel, they would be really strong. They'd also be really heavy. We build them out of aluminum. Why? Aluminum is weaker than steel, but it's way lighter. It's strong enough for the purposes of building a plane, right? You don't want a premise that's way heavier than the one you need to get your conclusion off the ground. We'll talk about why. If that metaphor doesn't help you, then don't worry about it. But it's one way I think that's helpful to maybe think about what good premises, good missing premises are and aren't. Anyway, and I'll say more about this next lecture, why this is, and a little bit more practice doing this, but filling in missing premises is tough. It's as much an art as a science. We will spend a lot of time on this because it's one of those things you get better with practice, but there's pretty much no way to get better than to practice.